welcome you all here, particularly the applauding fellows who don't even know what I'm going to say yet, but are already enthusiastic. I'm delighted. It's amazing how fast time flies. This is the final lecture of our regular lecture series. We do have one more lecture coming up in the CH Foundation series on freedom. That will be on May 4th, and will feature Gerald Bradley, who will be talking about contemporary challenges to religious freedom, and I hope that all of you can make that. It'll be at 5:30, scheduled now for, I think, room 169, where the service is going. Today, however, we try to sound a different note each time that we have an event. We move from subject to subject, but we want to try to, in each case, feature a big subject. And we certainly have a big subject today, climate change and climate change policy. Our speaker is Oren, who is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Studies, located, as you might guess, right in the center of New York. If I can recall correctly, it's across the street from Grand Central Station. So it really is at the very hub, not the hub city, but the hub of all the comings and goings and intellectual ferment that, cultural ferment that define New York. Mr. Cass has an interesting perspective on climate change that we're eager to have aired here because it's substantial and provocative, and that's one of the things we try to do in our lecture series. So hold on to your seats. It's going to be a wild ride, at least in terms of perhaps some of the expectations you have about what good climate change policy might be, and to give you the full thrill, let me now turn the stage over to Oren Cass.
Let's see. I think these microphones all work. Hello, thank you for having me. I should say I do not live in New York. I live in rural western Massachusetts, and I prefer not to be in the city if I can avoid it. But I spend about half my time working on climate change, and have been thinking about climate change for about 20 years, which is hard to do when you're in your early 30s. It was the high school debate topic in 1997 when I was in high school. It was, through the energy policy work I did, the topic of my senior project in college. It was the topic of my law school admissions essay. It was the first topic I worked on when I worked for Governor Romney's presidential campaign. It was the first thing I wrote about when I started doing policy writing of my own. And now it's part of my portfolio at the Manhattan Institute. And so it has for a long time been either at the front or the back of my mind. And I have watched it go from a niche issue that no one really knew what it was, to an Al Gore documentary, to, for the left at least, really something of an all-encompassing obsession, and a topic that is seen as first among many when it comes to policy, and I think in many people's perspective, by far the most important thing we can be thinking about, or talking about, or doing something about. And my own assessment has always been very different. I've always been puzzled by the climate change obsession. When I was doing debate, the climate change arguments were not the best arguments that we found worked very well. When we were doing our project in college, it didn't seem to make a lot of sense to talk about climate change as part of energy policy. And the more I started working on actual policy issues, the less proposals for dealing with climate change seemed to have anything to do with the climate change that everybody was talking about. It seemed like the risks were always overstated. It seemed like the costs of doing something would always outweigh the benefits. And at the same time, I always thought, well, wait a minute, what if this is right? You know, there's certainly those who just say, we don't believe the science. That's not my perspective at all. As far as I can tell, I think the science seems fairly reasonable, given my own expertise. I think it makes most sense to start from an assumption that the science is right. And so today, everything I talk about will assume that the so-called scientific consensus is in fact more or less, to the best we know, what things are going to look like. And so if that's true, then are the activists being the responsible ones? Or the people who are saying, we should be really, really scared and really obsessed with this, right? And people like me who spend their time being skeptical of this, kind of standing in the way. And I conclude the answer is no. I'm not wrong. And that it all comes down to this question of what kind of problem is climate change. So we know our president thinks climate change is the biggest problem. No challenge poses a greater threat to future generations, he said in the State of the Union. We know from the perspective of the United Nations, where do I point this? This is Ban Ki-moon speaking at the large Paris Climate Summit, where he said essentially that we have sown the potential seeds of our own destruction in all of our recent advancements, that the world is ticking toward climate catastrophe, that incremental approaches are not good, that we need a transformative agreement that will put the world on track for long-term peace, stability, and prosperity. And then you also have a very strong trend in psychology. This is Dan Gilbert, a Harvard psychologist. If global warming took out an eye, every now and then OSHA would regulate it into non-existence. The idea is, if it were only tangible, if we could only appreciate how dangerous this is, surely we would be doing more. And so we even have a name for this now. The experts have coined climate change the super wicked problem, by which they mean those who cause the problem seek to provide the solution. So we are all the problem, and we all have to be the solution. That there's no central authority to solve it. You would need a world government, and we don't have one. That time is running out, and that our responses discount the future irrationally. Essentially, it's very hard to solve, and it's really bad. And this thinking that it's unique this way, you then hear about, spoken of in the terms that it's somehow a collective action problem, that we all know we should do something about it, we just can't get our act together. And you hear metaphors like the frog in the boiling water, that this is slowly sweeping over us and will destroy us, but we can't sense it, and that is why we're not doing anything about it. And so it's become an obsession on college campuses. We're at a point now where the US Department of Justice and state attorney generals are subpoenaing opponents of climate action over their activism. People who disagree are called deniers. You have activists saying we should have war crimes trials for the people who denied that this was going to be a disaster. Very, very thoughtful people compare it to apartheid, to World War, to the Holocaust. And Esquire, of all places, had a very interesting article this summer called, what was the exact title? When the End of Civilization is Your Day Job, talking about scientists who study this for a living, who are experiencing symptoms like post-traumatic stress disorder. They're so overtaken with anguish at what they believe they're seeing. And as a result, I would say rational policy analysis has really broken down. Bernie Sanders, at the debate last week, I really love this quote. He said, you know, in 1941 under FDR, we moved within 3 years to rebuild our economy, to defeat Nazism and Japanese imperialism. That is exactly the kind of approach we need right now. Now, the 3 years when we were fighting World War II were many things. They were certainly an impressive accomplishment. But as a model for kind of what you want your country to be, it's not high up there. It essentially erased everyday life. It took all men of a certain age and sent them off to fight. And it essentially disrupted everything about our way of life. So speaking of that as the appropriate scale of response is really extraordinarily dramatic. And what I would like to convey to you today is that this is all wrong, but also why it's all wrong. That it's not wrong because the science is wrong. That instead, it's wrong because the histrionics are wrong. That this problem is not unique. It is a problem exactly like problems that we see all the time in all other facets of policy. And if we could think about it that way, we would realize that it's something we should consider. There are some rational policies we should probably pursue, but that we don't need to obsess about it, and that our moral standing in the world is not tied to how much of our time we spend measuring our carbon footprint. So taking hard to solve and really bad and breaking them down, hard to solve, question is what makes it hard to solve? Is it something unique politically within our country? Is it something diplomatic about our ability to work with other countries? Or is it really just a technical problem? And then really bad, is it catastrophic or is it just indeterminate? Is it just something that we don't really know, like most things that we don't really know will happen? And so I'll start with what makes climate change hard to solve. And I apologize, there are a lot of charts in this section, but I think it's important to appreciate what we're talking about when we talk about climate change and trying to solve climate change. So all of these lines are all of the different scenarios that the UN has created to try and model climate change. And what you're seeing is from 2000 to 2100, going up, essentially how high are emissions going to be? How much warming is it going to force? You have some very low scenarios, you have some very high scenarios, and they translate all of these lines into possible temperature increases. Now, the line I want you to focus on right here is the one called A1B. That's essentially what I would describe as the best guess base case. Based on how we know economies grow, based on how we know technology evolves, what do we think is most likely to happen if we don't take strong action on climate change? So what you see is by the 2100s, temperatures are up about 3 degrees from today, up about 3.5 degrees since before industrial activity began. And the reason that's important is that you can now say a lot of things if you follow that scenario about what the world would look like. So that's actually a world where the developed countries, richer OECD, Western countries, make incredible progress. GDP grows about 6x over the century, but we use 2/3 less energy per unit of GDP. So we get about 3 times as energy efficient. So we only use twice as much energy. And then we get much better at using cleaner sources of energy. We use 2/3 less carbon dioxide per unit of energy, which means our emissions actually drop. The developing world looks a little bit different. The great news, 66x economic growth, which is hard to even fathom, but is the kind of growth you get if you grow at 5% a year for a very long time. They get enormously more efficient, 88% less energy for every unit of GDP, and they get enormously cleaner, 70% less CO2 per unit of energy. The problem is their emissions still double from today. And so you're in a world where half of all energy is clean and renewable energy, but we still have much higher carbon dioxide emissions than we do right now. And if you want to understand what that means in terms of warming, the best way to think about it is just what is the total amount of carbon dioxide that humanity has pumped into the atmosphere. Because we know it stays there for a very long time. So we don't have to actually worry about when it goes in. We can just ask how much has gone in ever, period. And we know, based on the best available science, that we can put about another 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere without going above 2 degrees of warming, which is where a lot of scientists would like to hold things. If you look at just developed countries, that's about how much carbon dioxide we are likely to emit over the rest of the century. The problem is the developing world, which will emit 4 times more. And what that means is that even if we shut down our emissions entirely tomorrow, not only the US, Europe, all the developed countries just said we're going 100% solar tomorrow, we would still blow through the budget by about a factor of 4. And so we really have a very limited capacity in the wealthy world to do anything about the problem absent action in the developing world. So what can we ask the developing world to do? There are 3 reasons we actually can't ask them to do much of anything: baseload, scale, and cost. And these are the things you have to think about when you are building out an energy system. Starting with baseload, if you think about how much electricity the developing world uses today and how much they're going to use, you're going from about 11 terawatt hours a year in 2010 up to 73
terawatt hours per year in 2050, which means that 84% of what you're going to use each year hasn't even been built yet. And the problem is you can't build that with wind and solar. In a country like the United States, where we already get all of our energy from reliable fossil fuels that are there whenever you want them, it's pretty cheap and easy to add some solar or wind on top of that. If you're starting at 11 and trying to get to 73, you can't fill that in with wind and solar. You need to fill that in with coal and natural gas and nuclear, and then put some wind and solar on top of it, at least given the technology we have available today. The second problem is scale. Let's say you could build that with wind and solar would work. Do we have enough wind and solar to do it? The developing world needs to add about 1.5 terawatt hours per year every year, which means they're approximately building an entire new US energy system every 3 years. By comparison, total annual global production of solar panels last year was enough to get 0.05 trillion kilowatt hours. So you would need to increase our capacity to build solar panels 29x and then install it all every year if you wanted to do that with solar. That's actually the good news as compared to what it actually means practically to install it. If you think about what has been considered an enormous boom in the United States over the last 12 months, we actually only installed 0.009 terawatt hours. So you'd be asking the developing world to install renewable energy about 170 times faster than the United States has been able to do it. And then the question is, where are you going to get the storage from? Because you need to be able to store the energy when the sun's not shining, when it is shining, to use it when it's not shining. The entire battery capacity in the world that we can construct in a year right now is about enough to meet 1 minute of the developing world's demand. So if you need enough to be able to store 12 hours, 24 hours, days at a time, you're talking about a production of batteries that no one has any idea even how to contemplate beginning to build. And then finally is complexity. Coal plants are complex things, but they're actually fairly straightforward. We know how to build coal plants. Germany has been trying to convert its energy system to wind and solar, and estimates it's going to require about $1 trillion of investment over 20 years. Now, the developing world's population is about 50 times larger. So you're talking about a capital investment on the order of $50 trillion to build a set of energy technologies no one has ever tried building at scale, to build a much smarter grid, as they call it, than we have in the United States. And by the way, Germany hasn't even figured it out. Germany is struggling mightily, and there are active calls across political coalitions there to scale back how quickly they go. So base load, they can't use wind and solar. Scale, even if they could, we don't have enough of it. And cost and complexity, even if we could build it, the idea that struggling third world countries are going to be the vanguard of this kind of rollout are all fairly implausible. Instead, we are in fact in the midst of what the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science called the Renaissance of Coal. India is trying to double its coal production in the next 5 years. They are opening new coal plants 2.5 times faster than we are closing ours. Sierra Club identified more than 2,000 coal plants in development. If only half of those even get built, that's more new capacity than the entire base of the entire developed world. And so for the foreseeable future, coal is what is going to be built more so than wind or solar. This is over the last decade what got built. You can see coal is the very tall gray bars. This is just in 2013 specifically what got built. Coal is the tall gray bars. So coal is still the thing that is actually being added to the energy system fastest. And this is British Petroleum's projection through 2035 of coal beginning to level off, but continuing to be by far the largest energy source. Now, in theory, we have these very effective negotiations that have just been completed. There was an enormous conference in Paris. All the countries of the world came together According to Barack Obama, we got 180 countries to show up with serious climate targets for reducing their emissions. John Kerry said 186 nations submitted plans, all of them to reduce their emissions. But look at what they actually submitted. Here are the 7 largest developing countries by population. China submitted a plan to peak by around 2030, as they were already expected to peak, and to reduce the intensity of their emissions by about 60 to 65%, less than what they were already expected to do. So they basically said, what would happen if we made no commitment, and then made a commitment slightly weaker than that? That was ambitious compared to India's commitment. No skipping ahead. All right, well, don't read ahead. India committed to a 35% reduction in the intensity of their energy use, which is only about half the rate they're already improving over the last decade. So they proposed slowing down their progress significantly. Too vague to assess, does not allow for any accountability, was the assessment of Indonesia's plan. I wonder if I'm not pushing the right button. Brazil said 43% reduction compared to 2005, which would have been very impressive, except they're already 41% below 2005. Pakistan said we commit to reducing our emissions after reaching peak levels to the extent possible. That's a definition of a peak. Nigeria assumed that their emissions would actually grow faster than their economy. And Bangladesh said, how about if our emissions only grow by 247% instead of growing by 261%? So it is true that these countries all made commitments in Paris. But what they committed to doing was exactly what you would expect them to commit to do if they were much more concerned about helping their populations climb out of poverty than they were about climate change. And if they knew that the only way to do that was to ignore climate change while helping their populations climb out of poverty. This is MIT's analysis of what the Paris negotiations accomplished. The blue and green lines in some combination are what they previously thought would happen. The red line, ending slightly below by 2100, is what they think will happen with the Paris commitments. So a fraction of a degree of change across all of the world's commitments combined. And then finally we come all the way back to our friend A1B. The red thick line is MIT's projection. The blue dotted line just above it, that ends up in the exact same place as the red line, is the A1B forecast that we started with. So after all of this effort, after the closest the world has ever come to taking any sort of group action, we end up with exactly the same endpoint that we thought we would be at before we started any of the negotiations. And so that's why we are not going to solve climate change. It's not because we can't get all the countries in a room together. We can. It's because the countries who are creating all of the emissions this century very rationally, on their own, do not believe it is in their interest to cut their emissions. It's not a collective action problem. We can act collectively. It's that a lot of the countries simply do not believe it is in their interest to act. So if that's the type of problem it is, that's not actually a very unique problem at all. That's what I would describe as the way the world always works problem. And then the question is, but how big a problem is it? Should we be so worried about it that we need to spend all our time thinking about it anyway and trying to find ways to overcome part one? And I used to think about this a lot myself. I still do. I guess I'd say I used to worry about it a lot more myself. And then in mid-October, right as I was releasing my own paper on this issue, President Obama signed the Iran nuclear agreement, about which some people said this is a complete disaster, is going to lead to nuclear proliferation and all sorts of terrible things. And I thought, well, wait a minute. Why is it that if I say not acting on climate change is probably the best thing to do, that's a horrible, unacceptable opinion, but people can go and sign agreements with Iran whose effects could be worse, they could be better. We don't know one way or the other, and that's considered a perfectly reasonable position. How different is climate change from any of the other policy actions we have to think about that have long-term consequences that we don't know how exactly they'll play out? And I would say the answer is not different at all. And the place to start in thinking about that is with what is the most likely case. So you don't get any more scientific consensus than this. This is the Obama administration's own analysis of what the cost of climate change will be. They took 3 different models, the red line, the blue line, and the green line. And they said, depending on how much temperatures increase, what is the impact on global GDP? Now, one thing to notice is even the consensus models don't agree at all. One of them actually thinks some warming might not be such a bad thing. But let's go ahead and be generous. And take slightly above mid-case scenario at the highest level of warming. 4 degrees of warming, loss of about 3% of global GDP. What does that actually look like? Well, this is again the A1B baseline. So this is GDP growing from an index of 100 up to almost 1,500 by 2100. And here it is after the ravages of climate change. 3 degrees lower, we are only 13.5 times richer instead of 13.9 times richer. And if you think of that, about that year by year, it's actually even less impressive. It's about 0.03% less growth per year than you would have without climate change. Now, I would say it's actually hard to think of a policy issue that is less important than this, if this is what we're actually talking about. If you're debating good tax policy, the implications of getting it right or wrong are much larger. If you're debating good education policy, the implications are much larger. If you're talking about losing 3% of GDP over 100 years, you're really talking about something that no rational person would ever consider as a serious policy issue. How about natural disasters? People worry that we're going to have more natural disasters, that those will be incredibly costly. Roger Pielke Jr. of the University of Colorado updates a very good data set every year. He takes Munich Reinsurance's data for total global catastrophic losses and divides them by global GDP. And what he's found is that they keep going down, that we are getting richer faster than damages are going up. Now, that's not to minimize suffering. All of those disasters are costly, both in economic terms and in terms of human suffering, but they are not risks to the future of civilization, particularly if the line continues down in that direction. They only become more affordable over time. The EPA tried to conduct a study to show just how damaging climate change could be to the United States. They came up with 2 really big guesses for really, really costly impacts. One was that air pollution, they said, would actually be worse if temperatures are warmer. So on the left side, you have particulate matter, which is like soot. On the right, you have ozone. And here you can see how much progress we've made between 2000 and 2014. So particulate matter concentrations dropped significantly. Ozone concentrations dropped significantly. Here's how much worse things will be with climate change. See all the drama of my little reveal here. You're missing it. But you'll sense the drama. That's what it is. Now, how much did they say this is going to cost the United States? $930 billion, 57,000 annual deaths. Now, you can go read the scientific study that they used to come up with this. You can do a scientific study that does come up with this number, but I think it's hard to look at it and conclude that that would be the impact of that kind of increase in pollution. Their other big impact they came up with was heat-related deaths. They said, well, wait a minute. If it gets hotter, we're going to have more people dying from high temperatures. They started baseline in 2000. The size of the red circle is the mortality rate from heat-related deaths. By 2100, look at how huge those red bubbles are. Now, at first that's like, whoa, that looks terrible. But then you start to look at it and you say, but wait a minute. How are the red bubbles in the north of the United States, so much larger than they were in the south of the United States. In fact, this particular model suggests that in 2100, New York's fatality rate from heat-related deaths will be 50 times higher than Phoenix's is right now. Pittsburgh's rate will be 75 times higher. One way they got this was by assuming no adaptation. So no one in any of the northern states over 100 years of temperatures getting warmer chooses to install air conditioning. Even then, it's actually hard to build a model that performs this poorly, but they managed to do it. Oh, wait. And they managed to get 12,000 deaths and $200 billion a year of impact. So when you start to hear about the catastrophic claims, these are the kinds of places they tend to be coming from. And then I think one more that's really important to think about on a global scale, something that you'll hear about that is worth considering, is disruptions globally, is displaced people, both due to potential flooding, due to potential natural disasters, due to shifting water and crop possibilities. And you'll hear hundreds of millions of potential refugees, which is absolutely a human tragedy, but over 100 years, not at all different, and frankly very small relative to what we see today. So the UN says there are about 60 million refugees right now in the world, 232 million migrants living outside their borders. China alone has about 280 million migrant workers living away from home. So in that context, saying we're going to have hundreds of millions of people displaced over a century doesn't actually look that different from the way civilization has always muddled along. In fact, if you think about what will happen with urbanization anyway, these red bars are the percent of these different countries that live in urban areas today. The wider the bar, the larger the population. United States at 82%. If you take those other countries and imagine them becoming comparably urbanized, so those white areas fill up, you're talking about 1.3 billion people needing to shift in 4 countries. And so relative to that, the idea that you would have hundreds of millions of people displaced over the course of a century by climate change is again not a civilizational disaster. And an interesting thing happened at right about this point in the climate change debate, I would say. For a very long time, the view from the activists was, look at our models, we have very detailed models, and they were trying to argue with people who questioned the science. But then people skeptical of action said, okay, we accept the science, we looked at the models, and this is what we found. And when they said that, the activists had to flip around, and they said, no, 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 stop looking at the models. The models tell you the average case, but we shouldn't be making policy for the average case. We should be making policy for the worst case. And that argument comes in 2 forms. One form is what's called fat tail risk. And the argument here is, we know there's some distribution of possible outcomes. We know that it could be very bad, but we don't have just a very good sense of how bad it could be or how likely it is that it could be very bad. And so given that there's some possibility, you cannot exclude the possibility that climate change will cause catastrophic disruptions in our climate system and threaten human civilization, it doesn't matter how small a probability you assign to it. A very small probability multiplied by an infinite disaster is still infinity. And so it doesn't matter what the likely case or what the models say, we should still act as if civilization is at stake. Now the problem with that argument, of course, is that you can apply it to absolutely anything. You can pick any situation and say, well, I don't know, I'm a little bit concerned of some worst case scenario that I can make up. I have no science to support that worst case scenario, but I demand that you focus on it anyway. The other argument they then make is vaguer, and it's a little more atmospheric. It's the idea that we've never had a climate disruption before, and therefore we should not take the risk of seeing what happens if one occurs now. And at this moment I have a delightful video from the left of center website Vox that I think captures that spirit very nicely. If you can make that start.
One of the mistakes people make about climate change is saying that the planet is at stake.
Is it the last chance to save the planet from climate change?
Tens of thousands
else in Hollywood saving the Earth. Climate change and all that.
That's not really the right way to think about it. Earth has gone through immense climate changes many, many times before, and in some cases leading to mass extinctions. But life persisted. Mammals evolved from reptiles and primates from mammals. They stood up and walked out of Africa, eventually reaching the corners of every continent. But only after well over 100,000 years of wandering did the real human innovation happen, when 12,000 years ago we stopped foraging and started farming. Agriculture and villages, cities, society, government, the birth of civilization. But why did it take so long for humans to take control of their food? Well, if you look at this chart of global temperature change going back 100,000 years, you might notice something special about the last 10,000 years. That's when the climate settled into a period of unusual stability. It was on this ledge that human society developed, where reliable seasons fed more and more people, where knowledge accumulated and science began. Until eventually inventors created machines that could unleash unimaginable growth and mobility. All they needed was fuel to burn, and they found it in the form of ancient forests, buried under dirt and compacted over 300 million years. With these coal deposits, humans unearthed tons and tons of carbon that had been locked away long before our species appeared. And that's how we began to disrupt the climate that births us, the climate that our food systems and infrastructure are built upon. After 10,000 years of temperatures that varied only within about 1 degree Celsius, scientists now say we're on track for 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century if we don't change course. Humans have been around for 0.004% of Earth's history, and of all of human history, the 200,000 years since our species began, we've had agriculture for just 5% of that time. We've had electricity for 0.07% of that time. The simple truth about climate change is that it isn't new to the planet, but civilization is. And here's what's even newer. In the past 100 years, the number of people alive has quadrupled, and thus so has the capacity for suffering. So slowing down climate change isn't about saving the planet, it's about us, about our vulnerability to a level of climate disruption that human civilization has simply never seen before.
All right, so powerful stuff, right? What did you see in the video? A+ art direction. What didn't you see in the video? Any mention of potential impacts of climate change or their probability. Now you could tell from everything from the music that was chosen to the increasing agitation in the narrator's voice that the idea was that the very fact that we don't know what will happen should itself be the rationale for action. And increasingly that is the argument that I think activists are putting forward in the absence of any actual, what I would call substantive or mathematical arguments for the kind of action that they want. So what kind of problem is climate change then? I would say you would characterize it not as a super wicked problem that's unique, but based on 3 things that are actually very standard. 1, we have broad trends driving a predictable trend line. 2, we think it's fairly irreversible, and we don't really have a track record from which to predict the ultimate outcome. And 3, you can draw a causal chain from the disruption that you think will occur to a possible catastrophe. Well, here are some other issues we face that I would say look actually very similar. Superbugs created by overuse of antibiotics, pandemics created by the increasingly interconnected nature of our world, genetic engineering and the potential of artificial life forms being created and released, cyber warfare or cyber terrorism and our incredible vulnerability in all of our civilizational systems to technological disruption, artificial intelligence. There are people who think very seriously that the machines are going to take over very soon. 3D printing and the ability increasingly for anyone anywhere in the world to produce some pretty cool weapons. Local or regional conflicts, any of which, in theory, could become a larger conflict and ultimately a world war, and ultimately nuclear proliferation and the very presence of nuclear weapons all over the place. You can even think of some otherwise fairly benign seeming domestic problems this way. I think entitlements in the national debt is the most interesting one. You know, we know what the national debt looks like. We know what it will do over time if we don't do something about entitlement reform. And if you said actually sometime in the next 100 years the US economic system and government is going to collapse, that would be a pretty severe challenge and could easily trigger some of these other things and all sorts of broader problems. You can even look at the financial meltdown in that context. The very financial system that we operate, we already saw once get incredibly close to an almost complete collapse. Now we have Dodd-Frank. No offense to huge fans of Dodd-Frank out there, but Dodd-Frank has not eliminated the interconnectedness of the banking system or its possible subject to a run. And so we're still at risk of that kind of financial collapse. And then I would even say that you would put social issues in this category. What are we going to do about the collapse of marriage? That for lower income households and increasingly moving up the income ladder and increasingly spreading across societies, the idea of stable two-parent families that we know are the best way to raise the next generation are vanishing. What would we do about the end of work? This is tied to artificial intelligence, but you don't need to believe in the singularity to believe that we might make most workers irrelevant sometime in the next generation or two. Who knows what would happen if we did that? What would happen with population decline? Of course, at one time, population growth was on this list. Before climate change, excessive population growth was the thing that was a trend line that we didn't know what would happen, that could cause everybody to die. Now we have the reverse problem. We don't have enough children in the next generation a lot of the time. What would you even think about uncontrolled immigration? How do you project forward a world in which increasing numbers of people from third world countries can move, regardless of the legal system, into other countries? And what do you do if you take the disruptions you're already seeing in Europe and extrapolate those out 100 years? Now, I don't know that any of these things will happen. I also don't know that climate change will destroy the world. But it's hard, actually, once you think about it in these terms, to know how to even prioritize among these things. You know, sometimes the worst happens and it doesn't turn out to be a problem. Also, sometimes the worst happens and it does turn out to be a problem. We had some horrific world wars in the past century. Looking ahead to them from 1900, if you'd said, we've got a World War I and World War II coming, that would be very much on the scale of the worst possible climate change scenarios that are discussed. Obviously, those world wars were horrendous, but they didn't destroy civilization. In fact, many people see the end of World War II and the start of the atomic age as really laying the groundwork for the peace and the prosperity and all of the development we've seen since then. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague wiped out 60% of Europe in 4 or 5 years. But there are also people who say that the result of that was actually a critical cornerstone of the Renaissance. Now, is one of these things going to not only be a worst case, but unlike those, be the worst case that is truly too far? It could be. But there's certainly no scientific basis for asserting it, or for asserting that climate change, more so than the others, is the one that's going to be it. And so when we grapple with these kinds of problems, I would say there are a few different things we should think about. One is, what is the relevant time horizon? Are we talking about something that could flip? One day we're fine, the next day a zombie virus is sweeping the world? Or are we talking about something that over the course of generations we will need to adapt to? Because if it's the latter, it's probably a lot less dangerous. How likely is it? Are we talking about something that I can make up a scenario that you can't exclude? Are we talking about something that's a possibility? Or are we talking about something that very likely will happen at some point in time? What are we willing to credit as a proximate cause? You know, if you want to be legalistic about it, you can take everything and say it's a cause of everything else. And we hear that today in the climate change context. We hear a lot of people say, well, climate change causes ISIS, right? Because climate change may have worsened the drought in Syria, and the worsened drought in Syria caused more internal refugees, which caused et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and now we have ISIS. Maybe that's true, but it's a rather odd coincidence that the place where the terrorist organization arose in the context of unstable governments was the Middle East. Kind of seems like the place where we've had other terrorist groups arise independent of drought. It's hard to actually say climate change is what we're going to blame for that. Net effect is very important. Is this something that is an unmitigated bad, or is it something that there's probably some good and some bad? The bad is probably bigger than the good, but it's not as if this is nothing but catastrophe. And then finally, order of magnitude. You know, for me, the best thing to compare all of these issues to is world hunger. Today, around the world, you have hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people in dire poverty. You have incredible social challenges. And if you look ahead 100 years, are we actually saying things are going to be worse? Or are we just saying they're not going to be as much better as they could be? Because if we're just saying they're not going to be as much better as they could be, that's not great, but it's not something that we have to think of as an existential threat. And so for me, actually, world hunger is probably the best analog to climate change in a sense. It is a problem. It is going to cause suffering. Most of that suffering is going to be outside of American borders. And there's frankly not a whole lot we can do about it because we are not the ones who control the economic, technical, developmental issues that are going to drive its trajectory. And so in that sense, I think actually the obsession with carbon footprints today is this generation's equivalent of eat your vegetables because kids in Africa are starving. If you don't think about it at all, maybe it kind of makes sense. But as soon as you actually ask, what are we talking about? Who are we trying to help? You realize that what we can do in the United States, for the most part, has very little potential to change the way that things happen. And so the one exception to that, I would say, is innovation. The only way we are going to reduce our emissions over time in the United States and globally is if we have alternatives to fossil fuels that developing countries actually want to use, that are actually more attractive for their development than fossil fuels are. And some of those things exist, or could exist. But they don't exist today. And as long as we take the approach of saying we're going to subsidize solar panels and wind turbines to pull them into the market, we're just rewarding the creation and production of things that we know are not the solution. As long as we say we need a carbon tax to push fossil fuel prices up higher, all we're saying is, actually you don't need a solution that's better than fossil fuels, because we're just going to push the fossil fuel prices up until you can compete anyway. We would be much better off if we said, no, we're not providing that kind of support. We don't want you to bring your products to market until they are actually competitive with fossil fuels or have a path to get there. And so we are going to provide a lot of investment in research and development, as we do in a lot of critical areas. We're going to provide support for deployment. We might provide time-limited subsidies that you know you get for a couple of years, but you can't plan to live on for decades, like wind and solar have. And then go to it. And it's not going to solve the problem tomorrow. It's not going to prevent any warming from happening. But over the course of the century, it is the approach that is going to put us in the best position and allow us to muddle through just like we do with just about every problem of this scale that we face. And so that, I would say, is what kind of problem climate change is and how we can move forward with rational policy in a time of climate change. Thank you very much.
I told you it would be thought-provoking, and I'm sure there are many people who have either a thought or are provoked and would like to ask a question. Okay. Here's Mike.
Yes, I'm curious. What do you think the reason is if there's, as you said, obsessing or fretting about this, largely among the left? What do you think is the reason? Is it the grand conspiracy for Hollywood elites to run the world from some cobble and make us all drones and know where we are because we won't be driving our SUVs? Or is it guilt? Or is it genuine, just interpreting these facts in a different way than you have?
So I do not tend toward the grand conspiracy view. I was testifying before a Senate committee, and Sheldon Whitehouse spent his entire 5 minutes just ranting against all of the horrible groups that had given money to the Manhattan Institute and other groups. And I sort of just wanted to say, either the arguments I'm making are any good or they're not. And if they're not, then why don't you point that out? And if they are, then why does it matter who's paying for it? I think the motive questioning on both sides tends to be pretty counterproductive. I do think that there are some things about climate change that if you are on the left and you're looking at that list of catastrophes and choosing which one you want to talk about, make climate change very appealing. I chose not to do this final slide, but now it's appropriate. You know, the great thing about climate change, if you're interested in government intervention, is that everything causes climate change, and climate change causes everything. Energy use, land use, lifestyle, diet, children, all of these decisions you can attribute to climate change too. And then everything from weather to ecosystems to health. EPA just did something on how we should be concerned about mental health impacts from climate change. Terrorism, inequality, there's a new focus on the Earth's rotation. All of these things you can link to climate change. And so it actually provides a very useful catch-all for policies that you probably want to talk about anyway. And if that's the case, if you actually think, you know, that modernity and economic growth has gotten out of control, that we're despoiling the environment, and I think people on the left who want to take climate action do think those things, and could actually have a very good debate about them on the merits, well then why not talk about climate change? Climate change seems like a slam dunk, and for a long time it has been. I think increasingly it's not. And my hope is that as the debate gets away from we believe the science, we don't believe the science, and towards that's fine, we know what the science says, let's talk about rational and irrational responses, that trying to hook everything to climate change will become less attractive, and we can go back to having actual debates about things like environmental regulation, where the left has plenty of good points. There's a very good debate to be had about environmental regulation, and I'd love to see us have that instead of have one side try to essentially bludgeon everyone into submission by chaining it back to climate change.
First, I would like to thank you for your time to spend with us. I do have a few questions. One goes with, what is your opinion on carbon dating? Do you believe that it is 100% without a doubt true, like it's never incorrect, or do you think it has some time to have some improvement?
Do you mean carbon dating to estimate how old things are?
Yes, yes, sir.
I don't know anything about carbon dating.
You were mentioning carbon dating in the video, not, or the video mentioned carbon dating. The video mentioned carbon dating, so that's what.
Oh, yeah, I mean, so I think what the video was talking about was slightly different, and this is actually a very interesting area of debate, which is how do you figure out what the temperature was in the past? Early on in the climate debates, the activists thought they had a slam dunk case that they could show that climate had been incredibly steady until it has suddenly shot up. As people started to interrogate those claims, it turned out to actually not be, the evidence for that was actually quite poor, and it turned out to be one of the much weaker arguments. And so now, or at least for a period, you saw that argument downplayed. The claim that this is, what the so-called hockey stick became a lot less important, and everyone started focusing on the models. Now I think we are going back the other way, and the hockey stick fight is becoming bigger again. I'm fairly agnostic about it. I think it's been perfectly constant and suddenly spiked. Evidence is quite poor. At the same time, I think the rate of change that we are currently seeing is certainly very abnormal for the recent past.
And for my second question is why the activists, why are they making such a huge movement to promote such thing when I come from I come from the Permian Basin area where our main commodity is the oil. I saw thousands of people be laid off. I had my brother-in-law be laid off and then get his job back at a different company for a much less paid rate. Why do they make such a fuss about it when oil goes into everything that we produce? It goes into everything that you're wearing, goes into everything I'm wearing, everything in this room. And some type of process had to have oil. Why do they make others suffer just because they want to try to fix the world just a tiny bit?
That's an existential question in some respects. No, I mean, this goes to the much broader. Climate is actually one very narrow piece of this bigger debate, whether you're talking about how much oil we should consume or how much other types of industrial activity should we have, right? A steel plant pollutes in its own way. Are we going to tolerate that pollution, or are we going to lay off the steel workers? That trade-off between economic prosperity and environmental protection is a very direct one, and to my earlier answer, I would say is the debate that we should be having. Because if I were speaking on the pro-environmental side on that question, what I would say is two things. One, well, there are plenty of other jobs out there, maybe not today, but structurally, if we weren't emphasizing oil, other industries would grow instead. And so in the long run, we are much better off, while not being any economically worse off, shifting elsewhere. The second thing they would say is actually we're going to create more green jobs than we lose, for which I would say there is virtually no evidence, but as a larger piece of what tends to be on the left, a faith in a certain capacity for central planning and industrial management, I think they very much believe EPA regulation can create more jobs than it destroys. And I said two, but I'll add a third, which is, I think they would say, yeah, sorry, you know how many people that pollution kills? Either because they're talking about climate change or because they're just thinking about air pollution. And I showed the 57,000 deaths, $930 billion in cost. In the context of climate change, that obviously made no sense. But you did see that decline. You saw the 2000 to 2014 decline, right? And if you go back further to 1970, the improvements we've gotten in our environmental quality at an economic trade-off have been dramatic. And at some point, those are justified. You wouldn't say we should only do the economic thing and never consider the environment. And so I think if you get past the climate thing a little bit, you'd actually find a much more interesting, in a sense, environmental economic debate. And there you would find they have different values in some cases. They're making different assumptions in some cases. But that's where I think we'll actually make progress on the policy issue.
See people fanning themselves here. I wonder if the climate is changing right in this room. I'm sure there are other questions. Okay. We can pass that. I'll have to do more than pass it.
I just have 2 points I would like to comment on. The first one about how the heat might affect how many people we kill or anything. So I think for humans specifically, it won't be a real problem because we have thermoregulatory system and it's not, there's all things to change temperature anyway. But the main problem science focuses on is plants specifically and it affects the crop production and everything. So that's the first point. The second one, so that how science say like that Earth goes through these cycles of ice age every billions of years or something. So I think it's kind of weird. If they're saying that the temperature is the Earth temperature is increasing and we're actually heading toward an ice age. So should be really increasing, and if it's going through we're going heading to ice age. Should we really care anyway?
Yeah, good. So good questions. To take the first one about kind of ecosystems and plants and other species, I think those are substantial and totally valid concerns once you're just having the regular old economic environmental debate. I think, one reason you hear those emphasized less and why I didn't emphasize them is because frankly no one on any side is going to make the claim, well, someone will make any claim, but very few people are going to make the claim that concern about corals or those types of ecosystem issues justify themselves or even primarily the kinds of disruptions you would need to tackle climate change. So, right, so when Bernie Sanders is talking about this is the equivalent of, you know, fighting a world war, we're not going to fight the world war over the coral. You have to sell people on civilization being at risk to fight the world war. Once you move beyond that and get back to the rational debate of there seem to be some legitimate, serious environmental risks here, to what extent do we want to mitigate them and how can we do that responsibly? You'll ultimately strike a balance just as through the Endangered Species Act and through all sorts of other policies. We already address that every day, I'd say. You know, with respect to the Ice Age question, it's very interesting. There's an argument from the right, either that we would be going into an ice age or soon will be, so we should warm as much as we can, or that we're still coming out of the last ice age, and that this is, you know, this climate change is just what happens after an ice age, in a sense. I don't know that there's especially good evidence for either, or rather I should say my reading is that there is not good evidence for either of those claims. And so I think what you really have to focus on is the sharpness of it, of the change that we're talking about. Because, you know, when we were talking about, or when I was listing the ways to think about these kinds of problems, time frame is critically important. And if we were heading into another ice age, that's not an overnight kind of thing. So if there were credible evidence of it, then you might have to have the kind of discussion that you're having about climate change. But I think trying to kind of reverse engineer a defense of climate change by raising a counter climate change argument, for me at least, falls into the category of kind of, I'm going to try to find a way to just argue about the science instead of engaging on a more reasonable policy discussion.
Thank you. The question I have has to do with the projected increase in temperature, about 3 degrees Celsius, will take place over some extended period of time. The question is, if it does take place over an extended period of time, do we not recognize that plants, animals, and people have exhibited a capacity for adaptation so that when we get to a 3-degree increase in Celsius, we will have probably adapted to that increase, and therefore it's still no big deal. Is that a rational way of looking at it?
I don't want to call it irrational. I'll tell you the 3 problems with looking at it that way. One is that for plants and animals, when we talk about them adapting, they tend to be adapting to environmental changes over eons. They can only adapt at the rate they evolve to some degree. And so if you tell them, sorry, we're making a shift in the course of 100 or 200 years, that's actually incredibly quick for asking an ecosystem to adapt. So I think it's hard to say temperature has always changed, therefore plants and animals know how to change. Some of them do, but for some it's likely to be a real problem. For people, I think you're exactly right. People can adapt to a 3-degree change. The reason to still be concerned is all of the investment we have made in systems for the current climate. Meaning, for instance, we have built where we know the coastline is today. We have built all of our agricultural infrastructure where we know the wheat grows best today. And so even if over 50 or 100 years you say that's going to shift, we can adapt to that, but we shouldn't pretend it's free. we should recognize that there are very real costs associated with making those kinds of adaptations, given that we've planted everything where we have today. And then the third thing that's worth considering is that to a large extent, the climate system is not characterized by smooth, gradual changes as by tipping points. Or at least by which I mean, it is characterized not only by smooth, gradual changes, but by tipping points. So if you said, we know it's going to get 3 degrees warmer over 100 years, and at the end of the 100 years, it'll be 3 degrees warmer, the water level will be that much higher, things will have shifted that much further north, but other than that, it'll be the way it is now. That kind of adaptation feels very straightforward. What the scientists who are really concerned, and the activists picking up on that, are focused on is the issue of hitting a tipping point. So do we melt enough cold water off of Greenland that the Gulf Stream actually stops flowing the way that it does now? Right? Europe, if you think about how far north Europe is, it's like northern Canada. So why does it have a mid-Atlantic climate? Because of the Gulf Stream. If the Gulf Stream stops, Europe suddenly looks like northern Canada. You don't get a 3-degree increase there, you get a 20-degree decrease. I mean, I'm making up 20, but you get a much sharper impact. Another example is you can hit a feedback loop, where if you start to raise the temperature too much, and let's say ice starts to melt, one nice thing that ice does is it reflects sunlight away. The less sunlight you have, the less ice you have, the more sunlight's going to be absorbed. And so you worry that it builds upon itself and sort of can hit a runaway reaction. There are also a lot of reasons to be very skeptical you would hit a runaway reaction. But that's the other reason to think of 3 degrees not just as, all right, it'll go 0, 1, 2, 3, but rather the higher it goes, the higher the probability is that you might hit some more binary switch somewhere. Now, I would still say hitting that switch still is the kind of problem we know how to deal with. It might be more costly. It's not literally the end of the world. But that is one of the things that makes people more concerned about it.
You mentioned when you were in high school 20 years ago. Think about technology 20 years ago. You couldn't have predicted the things that we have today over the last 20 or 30 years. When we talk about adaptation, technology will adapt. We can have no idea what technology will be like in the middle of the 21st century. And dealing with these problems could be a snap with new technology. So you have to focus. You can't decide you're going to solve tomorrow's problems with today's technology. Tomorrow's problems will be done with tomorrow's technology, whatever it turns out to be.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it's important in 2 respects. One is just sheer level of wealth. Even if you said we're not going to have some new incredible technology, if you believe the kind of economic growth that we're talking about, you know, I showed the line with and without climate change, and it went from 13.9x to 13.5x bigger than today. Well, the other way of looking at that is that 0.4x, by today's figures, that's about half of the global economy. And so if you look at a number that someone's throwing out for 2100 and say, how much is that? Relative to today's economy, it seems catastrophically massive. Relative to the level of wealth we or our great-grandchildren are likely to have then, it seems a lot more reasonable to ask them to take that hit than us to take that hit. Unless you somehow believe you're truly going to go over the edge, essentially. And then the second point, as you said, is that the technology itself will be completely different, and that any effort to project what happens with 4 degrees of warming using today's technology is silly. And that's why I highlighted that EPA analysis of heat deaths, in which they explicitly say we assume no adaptation. You can get a lot of things to look really terrible if you assume no adaptation. If you assume that over the next 100 years we're going to move and rebuild major metropolitan areas anyway, that the very notion of modern life and things we need and the way we communicate, that all of that is going to be completely different, the economy is going to look completely different, then trying to apply today's model 4 degrees warmer doesn't really make any sense. And I think that's another reason to have a lot of hope that well, it's a reason to have a lot of fear about some of the other things on that list. That technology makes a lot scarier, but it's a reason to have a lot of hope that climate-related things will be at least relatively easier to adapt to.
My name is Mike. I was, the biggest thing that made me skeptical of the problem with climate change was when I found out that the Earth's atmosphere used to have 10 times as much carbon in it. And I studied and figured out that perhaps through the process of photosynthesis, plants took that carbon out of the air, and that's how it ended up in the sedimentary rock in the Earth. I've never heard anybody discuss the problem of global warming within that context, that basically the atmosphere is based upon a sympathetic system of how well the plants are doing. Secondly, it used to be that Earth's atmosphere mostly was thought to be affected by sunspots and volcanism, volcanic activity, and I haven't heard any discussion of that, in-depth discussion of that in relationship to man-made global warming. And I was wondering if you could address those two.
Yeah, sure. So, the first one with respect to what did it look like in the past, Earth's atmosphere has looked dramatically different at times in the past in terms of its composition, but also in terms of the climate. I mean, there have been times when the Earth has been dramatically warmer than it is. And that's one point that the Vox video gets right, is that on the scale of things the Earth has seen, 3 or 4 degrees from humans is nothing. Your point about plants, though, I think is also an important one to keep in mind, that not all feedback systems are positive, meaning people who are really concerned about climate change will really focus on the possibility that, well, if the ice melts, we reflect less sun, so it warms even faster. Or if the permafrost in Siberia melts, it's going to release methane, it's going to make things worse. But the Earth is also an extraordinarily robust system that has feedback effects that run the other way, that plants will take more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere when there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That if things get a little bit warmer, you're expecting to get more evaporation and more cloud cover. Clouds is in general an issue where there's no scientific consensus and a huge debate over even which way that cuts, and in different parts of the atmosphere as well. So for the kind of base question of, for a given amount of carbon dioxide, how much warming do you get? The things like plants and the feedback systems are less important. For the bigger picture, is this catastrophic or not? Those things can be very valuable buffers. And then remind me your second question. Oh, sunspots and volcanic activity. So, at a rough level, I would say a lot of the models account for those things fairly well. So the basic way they build a model that concludes that humans are contributing to climate change is they take temperature over the past 100 years, put in what they know about solar activity, put in what they know about volcanic activity, and say, okay, does that fit the line? No. Well, what about if we add the CO2 increase? And adding the CO2 increase helps fit the line. And that's what tells you that CO2 increase plays a role. There's still a lot of debate about the relative impact of that. I would say there's a fairly good consensus that CO2 is a major, maybe even the largest contributor, but there's still an enormous amount of active research and debate around how much is CO2 versus other things. And the reason that that's so important is that all of the scientific analysis comes down to a question of what they call climate sensitivity, which means if you double the amount of CO2 in the air, how much do you think the temperature goes up? Now, 30 years ago, they said, okay, somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. Since then, we've had 30 years of massive research and focus, and their latest estimate is 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius. If it is 1.5 degrees Celsius, and there are some people who say maybe it's even a little lower than that, then none of these scenarios really come true. Then even if we kind of keep going on business as usual, you get to 2 degrees or a little bit above. If it's really 4.5 degrees Celsius, then you get a much worse situation. And there are very recent studies that say the aggregate of all the latest studies show it's lower, and there are others that say no, but if you look at this set of studies instead, it's higher. Nobody knows. And that's why all of the claim, when Barack Obama gets up and says there's a scientific consensus that unless we act now, the world is at risk, that's simply untrue. The scientific consensus is that CO2 causes warming, and that human increased emissions of CO2 are therefore a significant contributor to the warming that we've seen. Whether it is the main contributor or a smaller contributor, and therefore what that implies for a little bit of warming for a doubling or a massive warming for a doubling, we don't know, and frankly have not made a whole lot of progress on. Actually, if you go from the UN's 2007 report to their 2014 report, by 2007 they thought they'd at least narrowed the range to 2 degrees to 4.5 degrees. And then in 2014 they came back and said, never mind, we're going back to 1.5 to 4.5. So we've actually gotten less sure and in a downward direction most recently.
Okay, go ahead. Do you have any time?
Thanks. The thing that I'm struggling with is rationally believing that increase in CO2 causes a rise in temperature when CO2 is, 390 parts per million? An infinitely, a significantly small part of the atmosphere as a component. How is it that such a small component of the atmosphere, even if it doubles, has any impact on warming at all? When water vapor, a very significant element of the atmosphere, has a lot to do with how temperatures go up and down.
Well, yeah, so I think the best way to think about the greenhouse effect, which is the idea that CO2 among other gases does have this impact, is to think of the Earth as a closed energy system. The Earth has a total amount of energy and heat held within the oceans, the atmosphere, and it's being bombarded with energy from the sun at all times. Now, at one extreme, if we had no capacity to absorb that energy, if it just bounced right off, then Earth would be a cold, dead rock. At the other extreme, if we absorbed everything that came in and released it off very slowly, we would get hotter and hotter and hotter. You'd look like Venus. So when you're talking about small changes in carbon dioxide having an impact on temperature, you're not saying tomorrow it's going to be 4 degrees warmer. What you're saying is that that shift over the course of 100 years is going to cause the atmosphere to retain a fraction of a percent more of the energy that comes in. You're talking about a very small fractional change in the Earth's absorptive capacity as a function of a very small fractional change of what's in the atmosphere. Problem is that if you do that over the course of hundreds of years and you keep absorbing a little bit more energy every day, then you get the warming. And so if you think of the total amount of energy the Earth is getting hit with from the sun and how much more of that it has to hold to get just 3 degrees warmer over an entire century. And that's why you're talking about very small changes in the composition of the atmosphere over very long periods of time, making small changes in the absorptive capacity.
One last question. Go ahead, deliver it. It's all yours.
My question is, we've been talking a lot about the carbon dioxide and just carbon in general. Yet, no matter what you do, you can't remove even, I would say, a small fraction of carbon, because everything that produces carbon, we have car exhaust, we have wildlife, we have farm animals. In fact, isn't it said that cow fart is about good 1/20th or a huge percent of the carbon dioxide? So why? My question to you is, why do they continue trying to fix the carbon when it's almost kind of useless? And instead, why don't we go to something that lasts longer, such as nuclear power?
So the way to think about carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere is that it's part of a system. It's constantly being added and taken out. If we had no fossil fuel emissions, it wouldn't drop to zero, because like you said, there are plenty of other sources emitting it into the atmosphere, and plants in particular at all times taking it out of the atmosphere. And so, as we were just talking a moment ago about throwing the system slightly out of balance on energy absorption, a step sooner we're also talking about throwing a system slightly out of balance on how much carbon dioxide is going into the system versus coming out of the system. And so when we talk about limiting the concentration in the atmosphere, we're not saying that's it, we have to shut down all sources of carbon dioxide. We're saying we have to shut down the disproportionate increase that is a function of industrial activity. And when I say we're saying, I should say they're saying, because I'm not saying. So that's what they're arguing. And not even that we ever have to get to zero, by the way, but that the massive increase of digging up fossil fuels and burning them is throwing that system out of balance. Now the question is, okay, what would you replace it with? And like you said, if you really were concerned, you'd probably really want to replace it with nuclear first, right? And that's the one other reason to kind of question just how dangerous a problem climate change is. If you think about the activists who are most worried about it, they're really, really worried about it as long as they're talking about these things that they'd like to change. As soon as you ask them about nuclear, right, Bernie Sanders wants to ban nuclear. So solving climate change is the most important issue in the world unless we're talking about nuclear power, in which case banning nuclear is more important. To some extent, you even see the same thing with fracking. Natural gas is tremendously cleaner than coal. But no one on the left, well, many people on the left want to shut down fracking anyway, even if it would reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And so I think you're absolutely right. If, to the extent that we want to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, the right portfolio is not wind and solar necessarily. Some of it might be carbon capture, meaning we're going to keep burning, running coal plants, but we're going to grab that CO2 and bury it or something. That's expensive, but is it more expensive than what you'd have to do with the solar and wind? Certainly not clear. We'd be talking about how fast can we expand nuclear and move towards newer, different, cheaper models for nuclear power. All of those things would be on the table, and a policy that focused much more on innovation and R&D would focus in exactly those areas instead of saying, how quickly can we pump subsidies into an industrial policy to get some technology that we really like built quickly, even though we know they're not the answer.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.